Suzanne Dewey et al.'s Gun Present. So we're exploring issues around conflict, violence, and the law in contemporary cultural anthropology, and we've turned our attention to a case study, a contemporary participatory and interdisciplinary ethnography that explores a description and interpretation of the U.S. justice system. In this ethnography, Gun Present, inside a Southern District Attorney's battle against gun violence, justice is defined quite a bit different than in our kind of colloquial and vernacular sense. Justice, in terms of the ethnography, is how individuals navigate an assemblage of violence, of community members, of physical buildings, of legal administrative records, of laws and proceedings, and ultimately of prosecution itself. I mentioned the idea of a participatory and interdisciplinary ethnography. And as we see, this is a coalition of writers. So we have Suzanne Dewey, but we also have Brittany Vanderberg and Hayes Webb. And as a participatory and interdisciplinary ethnography, it's quite an excellent model of contemporary work in cultural anthropology. So Suzanne Dewey is a cultural anthropologist, but worked with very closely Brittany Vanderberg, a geographer, and Hayes Webb, a district attorney for the state of Alabama. We think about Suzanne Dewey, although she is a cultural anthropologist, she actually teaches in criminology and criminal justice. She's the author of a number of different ethnographic books and articles, and she's been the recipient of grants from agencies such as the National Science Foundation, the Department of Justice, and Fulbright Hays. She is quite a public anthropologist, and her work has been featured in national media outlets such as the Chronicle of Higher Education, PBS, the Huffington Post, the Washington Post, and The Nation. Brittany Vandenberg, the geographer, also teaches in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. So she is a colleague of Suzanne Dewey. She researches gun violence, domestic violence, and prison reform in the United States, but she also does international research and looks at piracy laws and criminal justice systems in East Africa. In addition, Dr. Vandenberg is a special assistant to a number of different United Nations commissions and offices. The final participant to the research project is Hayes Webb, who got his law degree from the University of Alabama in 1997. Hayes Webb's worked in a variety of different contexts. He's worked in the military, he's worked as a public defender and private lawyer, and is now the district attorney of Tuscaloosa County in Alabama. And sort of his position in this project is that as a representative of the people of Tuscaloosa County, he believes it's very important and vital to engage with university partners to make the criminal justice process transparent to the public. There is a lot of criticism of how criminal prosecution takes place in the United States, and his engagement with Suzanne Dewey and Brittany Vanderberg is about making his office of the district attorney, of the state prosecution generally, much more transparent to the public. So the three of them basically are exploring a question. They're working together, and they're exploring a question that has a great public relevance, right? That is related to this major social problem of violent crime in the United States. They're interested in what are the challenges accompanying the prosecution of criminal cases involving guns. And so they use ethnography in the terms that we've been talking about. They use interviews and archival research. In the context of working directly with the district attorney, they get access to investigative reports of murder cases. This is one of the central parts of the data that's used in this book. And so this includes police reports, it includes witness statements, It includes evidence, photos, it includes phone records, and video and audio recordings. And what they're arguing is that when you want to understand what the prosecution of criminal cases involving guns looks like, you have to understand issues around the guns, you have to understand issues around the laws, institutions, and practices around violent crime. You need to understand the detailed relationships between witnesses, between victims, between defendants and jury members. That is essential to the prosecution of criminal cases. And then you sort of need to understand the moral worlds of each of the individuals in the group, such as jury members, how these moral worlds really also shape the prosecution and justice in such cases. Key ideas are that in a lot of the critical literature on the prosecution of violent crime, the prosecution of gun violence, that it's quite monolithic, that the criminal justice system is seen as a very unitary entity, defined as a system, kind of a machine almost, that's not human-like, that isn't just embodied human beings making decisions, interacting, and so on. There's more in the popular and critical understanding of prosecution, a simpler, simplistic understanding of it as a thing-like entity. And the authors, in working together and creating a different kind of description of what that process is like, really define it as an assemblage, a heterogeneous assemblage. So this is not machine-like, not object-like. It's a network of people, things, ideas, and so on that come into interaction. You have the phenomena of gun violence, and you have the phenomena of gun culture. You have the different community members, how they understand the state, how they understand each other. You have the physical locations, such as courtrooms and attorneys' offices. You have the different kinds of legal and administrative records and the laws and actual proceedings. You have prosecution, but it's simply one part of this much larger system. And if we want to understand it, if we want to understand the way the criminal justice process plays out, we really need to understand this complex assemblage to provide nuance, to humanize it, and so on. One of the key ideas that they're arguing is that, and this is definitely, you can understand Hayes-Webb role here, was to lessen the focus within the literature, within the public discourse on prosecutors, as though the whole outcome of criminal justice depends on the prosecutors alone. And in fact, they advocate for opening up the conversation, the public conversation about gun violence, about criminal justice prosecution, by actually looking more closely at the criminal offenders, looking at what the process of people like Hayes-Webb and others that are involved in the criminal justice assemblage, what they consider to be fair punishment, the ways that they approach fair punishment for those who commit crimes with a gun. They say that rather than focusing just on prosecutors, broadening this conversation to the culture of guns, where a state like Alabama has one of the highest gun ownership rates in the United States, that you can't understand gun violence, you can't understand the attempts to prosecute violent crime simply by focusing on prosecutors and not taking into account the criminal offenders, the sense of society to achieve fair punishment, and just the broad way of life that is enmeshed and wrapped around guns as a cultural kind of artifact. And unlike the existing public research, existing public discourse, they really advocate that ethnography, long-term participant observation with the criminal justice assemblage is essential to provide this kind of nuanced details, this kind of human characteristics, right, of criminal justice in the United States that is sort of sorely lacking today in the literature, in the scholarship. To conclude, again, thinking about conflict and violence in a gun culture. So we know that different forms of conflict and different forms of violence are related, right, to a way of life that generates a particular kind of conflict, that generates a particular kind of violence. And so for Dewey, Vandenberg, and Webb, they really draw our attention to, when we're thinking about the criminal prosecution of violent crime, well, that's occurring in a very specific context, right? It's a context of a gun culture where guns are more widespread and thus gun violence, right, is much more commonplace. They're also looking at the cultural responses to this kind of conflict and violence, the way the state, government, and law intervenes, right, in a modern industrial society. We see the state criminal justice system, an ethnographic vignette of it, if you will. And we have in Dewey, Vandenberg, and Webb's ethnography an attempt to try to describe and interpret, to increase understanding of the way the state, government, and law makes up parts of the process of prosecuting violent criminals, those who use guns, right, as a component of a crime. What are the different parts and components that make up the criminal justice system?